From a distance, it looks like any small American town. Streets curve gently past rows of houses. Street lamps line the sidewalks. Elm and maple trees shade a bandstand where music once drifted through summer evenings. Fishermen still cast their lines along the riverbank, just as they did more than a century ago. It feels peaceful, the kind of place you might drive through without a second glance. But nothing here was built for a town. Every street, lamp, and tree was designed for one purpose alone: to convince the people living behind them that they were not locked away. This was the Kankakee State Hospital, a mental asylum built to look like a neighborhood. Opened its doors in 1879, and it was, at the time, one of the most progressive institutions in the world. No chains, no bars on the windows of its cottages, no single looming asylum building swallowing every patient whole. Just a village, built stone by stone, on the belief that a gentler setting could heal a broken mind. And for a while, it seemed to work, but underneath the sidewalks and the shade trees, a darker current was already moving, one that no amount of good design could hold back. Because Kankakee State Hospital was not just fighting to help the people inside its gates. It was fighting the same rising tide that eventually drowned every asylum of its era. And by the end, the village would keep its houses, its lamps, its winding streets, and still lose almost everything else. Chapter 1: Illinois' Asylum Crisis and the Birth of an Idea. Long before the first stone of Kankakee State Hospital was ever laid, the state of Illinois was already facing a reckoning. In 1875, a woman named Elizabeth Packard published a report that shook the entire country. Its title alone was enough to unsettle anyone who read it: Modern Persecution or Insane Asylums Unveiled. Packard had once been committed to an asylum in Jacksonville, Illinois, not because doctors agreed she was mentally unwell, but largely because her husband had the legal power to send her there. Inside, she witnessed and endured a system with almost no oversight, no real accountability, and no meaningful distinction between treatment and imprisonment. When she was finally released, she did not stay quiet. She campaigned, testified, and wrote. And her account became part of a larger, uncomfortable portrait spreading across America. It revealed hospitals overflowing with patients, understaffed wards, and superintendents given almost total, unquestioned authority over the people locked inside their walls. Illinois lawmakers could not easily ignore what Packard's report had exposed. Public pressure was mounting, and it merged with a broader movement already taking shape across the country. One built by reform-minded physicians who sincerely believed that mental illness could be treated, not merely contained. These men called their philosophy moral treatment, and they argued that fresh air, structure, dignity, and a carefully designed environment could do something no chain or locked cell ever could. They could help a suffering mind recover. It was an extraordinary claim for its time, one that stood in direct contrast to centuries of fear and cruelty toward the mentally ill, and Illinois found itself standing at a crossroads between the old approach and the new one. In 1877, the Illinois General Assembly made its decision. Lawmakers voted to establish an entirely new institution, one built specifically to serve the eastern portion of the state, where existing hospitals were already stretched far beyond their capacity. It was named the Illinois Eastern Hospital for the Insane. The legislature granted the governor the authority to appoint a 7-member commission tasked with a single weighty responsibility: choosing where in northeastern Illinois this new hospital would rise from the ground. The commission did not take its task lightly. Site selection for an asylum in this period was never a simple matter of available land. Reformers of the era believed, with near religious conviction, that the physical setting of a hospital was inseparable from its ability to heal. A location needed open space, clean air, dependable water, and a landscape gentle enough to soothe rather than agitate a troubled mind. After careful deliberation, the commission settled on a site along the southern bank of the Kankakee River, a stretch of Illinois prairie graced with native oak, ash, and pine, within easy reach of the growing rail lines that connected it to Chicago and the rest of the state. Once the location was chosen, 3 trustees were appointed by the governor to oversee everything that would follow, supervising construction, selecting a superintendent, and ultimately running the hospital once it opened its doors, all of it subject to inspection by the state's Board of Commissioners of Public Charities. These men inherited an enormous responsibility. They were not simply building a hospital. They were being asked to prove that an entirely different philosophy of care could work, one built on trust rather than restraint, dignity rather than confinement. At the time this decision was made, one single architectural philosophy dominated American psychiatric design almost completely. It had been developed decades earlier by a Philadelphia physician named Thomas Story Kirkbride, and by the late 1870s it was treated less like an option and more like an article of faith among hospital superintendents across the country. Kirkbride's ideas would become the blueprint for the very first building to rise on the Kankakee site. A structure so ambitious in scale and so precise in its design that it would come to define the hospital's public identity for more than a century. But before a single brick of that building could be laid, the men behind Kankakee had to fully absorb what Kirkbride was demanding of them and just how uncompromising his vision truly was. Chapter 2: Kirkbride's Vision Made of Stone. Thomas Story Kirkbride was not an architect. He was a physician, the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, and yet his influence on American asylum architecture would eventually outweigh that of almost any trained designer of his era. In 1854, he published a book that would shape the physical form of mental hospitals across the entire country for the next 50 years. Its title was long and clinical, On the Construction, Organization, and General Arrangements of Hospitals for the Insane. But its contents read less like a medical text and more like the obsessive notebook of a man convinced that architecture itself could cure suffering. Kirkbride believed, with total sincerity, that a building could either heal a broken mind or deepen its wounds, and he was determined to leave nothing to chance. He wrote about sunlight and airflow, with the intensity most physicians reserve for surgery. He insisted on wide corridors, tall ceilings, and windows placed to catch the maximum amount of daylight. He railed against foul odors drifting through hospital wards, demanding, in his own words, a steady and strong downward current of air so that unpleasant smells would become scarcely possible. To Kirkbride, a damp mop left in a hallway was not a housekeeping oversight. It was a failure of moral treatment itself. Every detail, down to the placement of a doorway, carried therapeutic weight in his mind, and asylum superintendents across America treated his instructions with something close to scripture. When the trustees of the new Illinois hospital needed someone to translate Kirkbride's demanding vision into an actual physical structure, they turned to a Chicago architect named James R. Willett. Willett was no stranger to ambitious engineering. He had trained as a military engineer before turning to civilian architecture, and the task in front of him now required both. He needed to design a building that would satisfy Kirkbride's exacting philosophy, while also becoming a true architectural landmark, something the people of Kankakee could look upon with pride rather than dread. What Willett produced would come to be known simply as the Administration Center, and it remains even today the single most recognizable structure the hospital ever built. Rising 4 stories above a raised basement and crowned by a soaring 7-story clock tower, the Administration Center was constructed. Willett designed the building with strict, deliberate symmetry, offices occupying the central mass beneath the tower, with long, patient wings extending outward on either side, their walls broken by alternating polygonal and rectangular bays that caught the light differently throughout the day. At each end of the building, 2 pavilions projected forward to embrace the sweeping lawn beyond, a landscape gesture as much as an architectural one, designed to soften the institutional bulk of the structure and frame it within something gentler. The tower itself became something far greater than a functional clock housing. It became a symbol, visible for miles across the flat Illinois prairie, an unmistakable landmark that told the people of Kankakee exactly where the hospital stood, and exactly how permanent, how serious, and how unavoidable its presence in their community truly was. When the doors of the Administration Center finally opened on September the 4th, 1879, it represented the absolute pinnacle of what Kirkbride's philosophy could achieve, a building of real grandeur built entirely in service of the mind. But even as workers finished laying its final limestone blocks, an unseen rebellion against Kirkbride's rigid one-roof orthodoxy was already stirring elsewhere on the very same grounds, one that would make Kankakee unlike any hospital built before it. Chapter 3: The Journey That Broke the Mold. While James Willett's tower was still rising above the Kankakee prairie, one member of the hospital's governing commission was already looking far beyond it, and far beyond American shores altogether. His name was Frederick Wines, secretary of the Illinois Board of Charities, and the trustees had given him an assignment that would end up reshaping the entire future of the institution. He was sent across the Atlantic to study how other nations cared for their mentally ill, in the hope that whatever he discovered abroad might be of service in planning the new hospital taking shape back home. Wines traveled through Geel in Belgium, Clermont in France, Cheadle in England, and the Scottish towns of Cupar Fife and Lenzie, observing firsthand how each community approached the housing and treatment of the mentally ill. What he found overturned nearly everything the American psychiatric establishment held sacred. In these European communities, patients were not gathered beneath a single sprawling roof under the constant gaze of one physician. Instead, they lived in separate, smaller houses, arranged along real streets, lined with sidewalks and plantings, deliberately built to resemble an ordinary country village rather than a hospital at all. It was, in almost every visible way, the exact opposite of Thomas Kirkbride's design philosophy, the very philosophy that had just produced Kankakee's own magnificent administration center. The tension Wines returned home with was not a small professional disagreement. Kirkbride's ideas had been treated with something close to religious reverence among hospital superintendents, and any deviation from them was regarded within the profession as something close to heresy. To suggest that patients might actually recover more effectively living in smaller, home-like cottages, scattered and separate rather than centralized under one watchful roof, was to challenge the foundation of an entire discipline. It required no small measure of courage to defy the near-unanimous consensus of one's own colleagues, especially when there was no true precedent in the United States to point to as proof the idea could even work. Every superintendent who dared to champion it risked ridicule, professional isolation, and outright failure, with critics loudly predicting disaster well before a single cottage was built. Wines pressed forward anyway, carrying what he had witnessed abroad back to the Illinois General Assembly. And in 1879, lawmakers made a cautious but historic decision. They approved an experimental appropriation of $30,000, earmarked specifically for the construction of detached wards capable of housing no fewer than 80 patients. It was a modest sum set against an enormous gamble, a tentative first step taken by a state government willing to test an idea that the rest of American psychiatry still viewed with deep suspicion. 2 years later, the legislature increased its appropriation for additional detached wards, and again in 1883, a sign that the experiment, against considerable odds, appeared to be working. Slowly, cottage by cottage, a second hospital began rising alongside the grand stone tower Willett had already completed. A hospital within a hospital, built on an entirely different set of convictions. History would ultimately credit Frederick Wines with something remarkable: the construction of the very first cottage plan hospital in the United States. What began as an experimental gamble in the Illinois prairie soon rippled outward across the entire country. Within just 11 years of Kankakee's first cottages going up, other states began adopting the same detached ward philosophy for their own institutions. A single research trip undertaken by one determined state official had quietly rewritten the architecture of American mental health care. But an idea on paper is one thing. Turning it into an actual livable landscape, one that could convincingly disguise an institution as a peaceful country village, required a very different kind of vision, one rooted not in medicine or policy, but in the careful, almost sculptural art of shaping land itself. And for that, the trustees of Kankakee turned to a landscape architect, who understood just how deeply a place could reach into the human heart. Chapter 4: Building a Village for the Insane. His name was H.W.S. Cleveland, and by the time Kankakee's trustees brought him onto the project, he was already one of the most respected landscape architects working in the American Midwest. Cleveland had spent years working alongside Frederick Law Olmsted, widely regarded as the founder of American landscape architecture and the mind behind Central Park in New York City. Together, the two men had helped design what would become one of Cleveland's most celebrated works, Prospect Park in Brooklyn, New York, a sprawling green refuge carved out of dense urban land. Cleveland understood that a landscape was never just decoration. It was capable of shaping how people felt, how they behaved, and how they healed. When Cleveland arrived at the hospital, his task was explicit and unusual: lay out the grounds in his own words with reference to the creation of a village for the insane. It was not a hospital campus he had been asked to design. It was an illusion of ordinary life, convincing enough that the people living within it might forget, even briefly, that they were patients at all. Cleveland set to work laying broad, gently curving roads across the property, deliberately avoiding the rigid geometric grid so common to institutional planning. Two wide avenues ran parallel to each other, bordered by sidewalks and shaded by elms and maples, designed to feel less like hospital pathways and more like the main streets of any small American town. Elegant cast-iron street lamps and matching park furniture lined these avenues, small details that, taken together, transformed cold institutional grounds into something that resembled authentic civic pride. Cleveland was known throughout his career for framing his landscapes with carefully chosen entrance drives, and at Kankakee, he built a long alley leading visitors toward the grounds, along with a sweeping entry turnaround that still curves in front of the administration center today. He planted masses of trees in deliberate clusters to create distinct, changing spatial experiences as visitors moved through the property, an ash grove surrounding what would become a bandstand, a stand of evergreens set apart to the east, and a quiet pine grove offering shade and stillness. His preferred plantings, elms, basswood, and white ash, took root across the grounds, some of them still standing more than a century later. A see-through iron fence and limestone gateposts, subtle rather than imposing, marked the property's edges, boundaries that suggested containment without announcing it. There may have been something deeply personal woven into Cleveland's work at Kankakee. Historians examining his papers have noted that his wife suffered from mental illness in the later years of her life, described in the language of the period as nearly insane. Whether or not this shaped his approach, Cleveland brought an unmistakable sensitivity to the commission, a level of care that went well beyond the standard requirements of a state contract, seeming to believe, alongside Kirkbride and wines before him, that a well-placed tree or a gently curving road might do more for a suffering mind than any locked door ever could. Behind Cleveland's winding streets, the first cottages of Wines's detached ward experiment began rising from the ground, roughly 20 of them, constructed south of the administration center by 1893. They stood 2 stories tall, modest in scale, but genuinely residential in feeling, a radical departure from the imposing institutional wings just a short walk away. Of those original 20 cottages, only 4 survive on the grounds today, silent survivors of an experiment that no one was certain would work at all. Together, Cleveland's grounds and Wines's cottages created something genuinely unprecedented in American institutional history, a hospital that did not look, sound, or feel like a hospital at all. Word of what Illinois had built began to travel, drawing the attention of some of the most important reformers and thinkers in the country, figures who would come to the hospital not merely to visit, but to study, teach, and in some cases, leave their own permanent mark on the institution's identity. Chapter 5. The Reformers' Faces Within. By the 1880s, Kankakee was no longer simply an experiment tucked away in the Illinois prairie. It had become something closer to a proving ground, a place where the nation's most influential minds in mental health reform came to test their theories, exchange ideas, and, in a handful of cases, quietly shape the future of American psychiatry itself. Among the earliest and most significant of these figures was Dorothea Lynde Dix, a name already legendary in reform circles by the time she turned her attention toward Kankakee. Her involvement in the theoretical discussions shaping the hospital's treatment program lent the institution a kind of moral authority few asylums in the country could claim, a direct link to the woman who had forced America to confront how it treated its most vulnerable citizens. Alongside Dix stood another towering intellectual figure of the era, the philosopher John Dewey. Dewey's presence at Kankakee, contributing to conversations about the theoretical foundations of patient care, reflected just how seriously the institution was being taken beyond the narrow world of medicine. This was not simply a hospital following orders from Springfield. It was a real intersection of psychiatry, philosophy, and social reform, a place where questions about the nature of the human mind were being debated by some of the sharpest thinkers in the country. In 1885, the hospital welcomed a young physician named Dr. Delia Howe, one of the very first women in the entire state of Illinois to practice medicine. Her arrival at Kankakee carried significance well beyond her individual talent. In an era when women were routinely barred from medical schools, dismissed from serious scientific work, and treated as unfit for positions of clinical authority, Howe's presence on the hospital's medical staff steadily challenged the assumptions of an entire profession. The following year, in 1886, the hospital expanded its role even further, launching a formal training program for nurses, an initiative that would help professionalize psychiatric caregiving at a moment when such care was still too often left to untrained attendants with little more than physical strength and a willingness to follow orders. But of all the figures who passed through Kankakee during these formative years, none would leave a deeper mark on the future of American psychiatry than a young Swiss-born neuropathologist named Adolf Meyer. Meyer arrived at the hospital in 1893, drawn by the hospital's growing reputation for architectural innovation and its willingness to embrace the detached ward philosophy that much of the profession still viewed with suspicion. He was only in his late 20s at the time, yet he would go on to become the dominant figure in American psychiatry during the first 4 decades of the 20th century. A man whose influence became so deeply woven into the profession's practice that its origins were often forgotten entirely. It was at Kankakee that Meyer began developing the foundations of what would eventually become his theory of psychobiology, an approach that insisted a patient's mental condition could never be understood in isolation. Instead, Meyer argued that psychiatrists needed to study the whole person, their medical history, biography, social circumstances, even their artistic and educational background, treating each patient as a complete human being rather than a collection of isolated symptoms. It was a strikingly holistic idea for its time, one that rejected the abstract, purely theoretical models favored by some of his European contemporaries in favor of a grounded, common-sense understanding of the individual mind. Meyer's laboratory at the hospital would later be preserved almost exactly as he left it, eventually becoming part of a museum housed inside the very tower that had once symbolized Kirkbride's rigid, one-roof philosophy. Meyer's time at the hospital proved relatively brief. In 1895, he departed for Johns Hopkins Medical School, carrying with him the ideas he had begun to shape along the banks of the Kankakee River. He would go on to live until 1959, spending the better part of the next 6 decades expanding and refining his theories, training generations of American psychiatrists, and fundamentally altering how the profession understood mental illness. Yet his connection to Kankakee never fully disappeared. His preserved laboratory and the artifacts of his tenure remain in the tower to this day, lasting physical evidence that, for a short but truly significant window, this converted stretch of Illinois farmland stood at the very center of American psychiatric thought. By the turn of the century, Kankakee had achieved something few state institutions ever manage. It had become simultaneously an authentic architectural landmark, a legitimate center of scientific research, and a magnet for some of the most important reformers in the country. From the outside, it must have seemed as though the experiment had succeeded completely, proof that compassion, careful design, and serious science could triumph over the darker instincts that had shaped asylums for generations. But prestige and progress could not hold back what was already beginning to happen just beneath the surface of Kankakee's tree-lined streets, a steady, relentless pressure that even the sharpest reform-minded thinking would ultimately fail to contain. Chapter 6. The Flood Begins. There is a particular kind of danger that comes with success, and Kankakee was about to learn it firsthand. Word of the hospital's humane design, its village atmosphere, its cottages without bars, its progressive treatment philosophy, had spread far beyond the borders of Illinois. But that same reputation, the very thing that made Kankakee remarkable, also made it a magnet. Families desperate for somewhere, anywhere, to send a struggling relative heard whispers of a hospital that did not look like a prison, and they came. Courts committing the indigent, those struggling with addiction, the elderly with nowhere else to go, the physically disabled, the developmentally disabled, and the truly mentally ill alike, all of them funneled toward institutions like Kankakee, because in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was often nowhere else for any of them to go at all. By 1902, the numbers had already become staggering. More than 10,000 patients had passed through the hospital's doors since it first opened, a figure that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the commissioners who had cautiously approved that first $30,000 cottage experiment barely 2 decades earlier. At that same moment, the hospital's resident population stood at 2,250 people, all of them housed across a campus that had been meticulously designed, cottage by cottage, avenue by avenue, for a far more modest and manageable scale. The village model had never been built to absorb a flood. It had been built for a trickle, a careful therapeutic community, where a handful of patients could live in something resembling a real home. 2,250 residents was not a village anymore. It was a small city, dressed in the architecture of a hamlet, and the numbers kept climbing. By 1924, the hospital's population had swollen to 3,348 patients, an increase that outpaced nearly everything the original planners could have anticipated. More cottages went up during this period in a desperate effort to keep pace. Buildings built quickly and cheaply, adding capacity rather than atmosphere. But no matter how many cottages rose along Cleveland's curving streets, the fundamental promise at the heart of the detached ward philosophy, that patients could live in small, home-like groups under close, personal, attentive care, was eroding beneath the sheer weight of numbers no one had planned for. This was not a crisis unique to Kankakee. Across the entire country, state asylums were drowning under the same rising tide. As American society industrialized, urbanized, and grew increasingly willing to institutionalize anyone deemed inconvenient, difficult, or simply different, state governments found themselves committing more and more people to facilities that had never been designed, funded, or staffed to hold them. Public acceptance of insanity as a medical condition rather than a moral failing paradoxically accelerated the crisis rather than easing it, because it meant more families felt justified sending relatives away, and more courts felt comfortable committing individuals who might simply have remained at home. What made Kankakee's situation particularly bitter was the contrast between its founding ideals and its unfolding reality. This was a hospital built specifically to prove that architecture and landscape could heal, that a gentle setting mattered as much as any medical treatment. Every curving road, every carefully placed elm tree, every cottage had been an argument, made in stone and greenery, that dignity itself was therapeutic. But dignity requires space, attention, and time. 3 resources that grew scarcer with every new patient admitted through the hospital's gates. Overworked attendants, stretched across cottages never designed to hold so many people at once, could not possibly offer the same personalized moral treatment that Kirkbride, Wines, and Cleveland had all envisioned in their respective ways. The village had become crowded, and a crowded village, no matter how beautifully designed, begins to feel like something else entirely. There is something tragic in watching an ideal slowly buckle, not because it was flawed in conception, but because it was overwhelmed by forces entirely outside its architect's control. Kirkbride had not anticipated a state government using his humane design as a dumping ground for society's unwanted. Wines had not traveled across Europe studying detached wards, only to watch those same cottages packed far beyond their intended capacity. And Cleveland had certainly never imagined his carefully composed groves and alleys, designed to soothe a handful of struggling minds, would eventually shade thousands of patients crammed into a system steadily buckling under its own success. The hospital had built something meaningfully different from every other asylum in America, but different was not the same as immune. And as the 20th century progressed, the hospital would keep building, expanding, and adding new structures in a desperate attempt to keep pace with a tide that showed no sign of receding. Chapter 7. New Century, Same Old Wait. As the new century unfolded, Kankakee entered a strange, almost contradictory phase in its history. On the surface, it looked like an institution still moving forward, innovating, committed to the founding belief that thoughtful design could ease human suffering. Beneath that surface, however, every new structure rising on the grounds was really just another attempt to hold back the same overwhelming tide of admissions that had already begun reshaping the hospital's identity. Around 1900, a chapel building known as Serva North was completed, and tucked into its basement was something unexpected for an institution once defined by rigid supervision: a gymnasium built specifically to encourage recreation and dancing among patients. That same year, a bandstand rose on the grounds as well, a small wooden stage where outdoor concerts could be held beneath the very ash grove HWS Cleveland had planted decades earlier, proof that even amid growing strain, the hospital had not entirely abandoned its founding belief in the therapeutic power of everyday pleasures. More additions followed as the years passed. In 1915, a beauty and barber shop opened on the grounds, a small but telling gesture towards something the earliest generation of asylum superintendents rarely considered essential: personal grooming and simple human dignity. By 1928, a dedicated vocational center had been constructed, formalizing what had long been an informal practice at Kankakee, putting patients to work. For decades, doing farm labor, raising crops, and tending hogs had been woven into the hospital's daily rhythm, framed by administrators as a form of treatment. Productive activity thought to calm restless minds and instill a sense of purpose. Whether this work truly served the patients performing it remained an uncomfortable question that the hospital's own records rarely addressed directly. Fallow fields surrounding the property today still stand as a lasting reminder of those decades of labor. Architecturally, this era belonged largely to two men. William Kirkbride Zimmerman served as Illinois' state supervising architect from 1905 to 1913, and again later in the 1920s, overseeing hospital construction projects across the state during both stretches of his tenure. At Kankakee specifically, Zimmerman designed the Vocational Center, sometimes called the Trades Building, in 1928, and the following year completed a Georgian Revival-style residence known as the Staff House. Following him came Charles Herrick Hammond, who held the same state supervising architect role from 1929 into the late 1940s, leaving his own mark on the hospital with Building 704, completed in 1939, a striking structure blending classical revival details with the sleeker, more modern architectural language beginning to emerge across the country. Alongside these larger institutional buildings, a quieter architectural shift was taking place across the cottages themselves. The original two-story detached wards that Wines had championed back in the 1880s were gradually giving way to a new preferred design: single-story cottages that kept patients closer to the earth, literally as well as symbolically. Serva South, also known as Building 417, completed in 1925, exemplified this newer approach. The Illinois Blue Book of 1927 captured the reasoning behind this shift in strikingly tender language, noting that patients housed in these single-story cottages were frequently able to touch the ground and enjoy the invigoration of the earth and the grass. These buildings had no bars on their windows. None were ever placed there at all, a detail the report seemed almost proud to highlight, as though it needed reassurance that Kankakee still remembered what it had originally set out to be. And yet, for every gymnasium, barber shop, and carefully designed single-story cottage, the underlying arithmetic of the institution never truly changed. New buildings could soften the experience of confinement, could offer patients small moments of ordinary pleasure, dignity, and comfort, but they could not solve the deeper structural problems steadily consuming Kankakee from within. a population that kept growing far faster than the institution's capacity to truly care for each individual soul inside its gates. The hospital was running as fast as it could simply to keep from falling further behind. Chapter 8: Deinstitutionalization and Rebirth. Even as new cottages and vocational buildings continued rising across the Kankakee campus, the ground beneath the entire American asylum system was beginning to shift in ways construction alone could not address. The documented overcrowding at institutions like Kankakee, alongside a wave of national exposés revealing similarly troubling conditions at state hospitals across the country, began fueling a broader movement within psychiatry itself, one that came to be known as the mental hygiene movement. Where the previous century had focused almost entirely on architecture and environment as the primary tools of treatment, this new generation of reformers turned their attention towards psychology itself. Healing, they argued, might come not from a well-placed elm tree or a gently curving street, but from something happening deep within the patient's own mind. By the middle of the 20th century, American psychiatry had grown into something far more complex than the single-minded architectural philosophy that had given birth to Kankakee decades earlier. Bureaucratically, the hospital's identity was already shifting as well. In 1909, the state's Board of Commissioners of Public Charities, the very body originally responsible for overseeing the institution, was abolished and the hospital was reorganized under a new name, effective January 1st, 1910. What had opened its doors in 1879 as the Illinois Eastern Hospital for the Insane now became simply the Kankakee State Hospital, a name that would follow it for the next 6.5 decades. Oversight shifted again in 1917, when Illinois' newly formed Department of Public Welfare assumed responsibility for the institution, a role it would hold until 1961. When the state consolidated its mental health operations under a dedicated Department of Mental Health, reflecting just how specialized and professionalized psychiatric care had become since Kirkbride first put pen to paper more than a century earlier. But the most profound transformation in the hospital's long history was still to come, and it arrived not as a single dramatic event, but as the culmination of decades of shifting philosophy, mounting criticism, and a growing national consensus that large, centralized institutions, however humane their original intentions, were no longer the answer to mental illness or developmental disability. Across the country, the deinstitutionalization movement was gathering unstoppable momentum by the middle of the 20th century, driven by new psychiatric medications that made community-based treatment increasingly viable, by disturbing exposés of conditions inside overcrowded state hospitals, and by a growing disability rights movement that rejected the very premise that people with mental illness or developmental disabilities must be separated from the rest of society. On May 10th, 1974, Kankakee State Hospital underwent its final, defining transformation. The institution ceased operating as a general mental health hospital altogether, narrowing its mission to serve exclusively individuals with developmental disabilities. Patients still receiving treatment for mental illness were transferred elsewhere to other facilities scattered across the Illinois state system, severing, in a single administrative decision, a direct line of continuity stretching all the way back to the hospital's founding purpose nearly a century earlier. The institution that had once housed thousands of patients under the banner of curing insanity would now serve an entirely different population, with an entirely different mission. Alongside this transformation came a new name, one that would replace Kankakee State Hospital for good. The institution was renamed the Samuel H. Shapiro Developmental Center, honoring Samuel H. Shapiro, the Illinois governor who had served from 1968 to 1969, and who, fittingly, had once resided in Kankakee himself. It was a name meant to signal a clean break from the past, a rebranding that distanced the facility from the word asylum entirely, and from everything that word had come to represent by the middle of the 20th century: overcrowding, institutional failure, and a philosophy of care the country had largely moved beyond. And yet, a name change, however well-intentioned, could not erase what had happened on those grounds across nearly 100 years. the tower still stood. The curving streets Cleveland had designed still wound their way past cottages built for a village that had never truly existed in the way its architects imagined. Beneath the surface of this rebirth, as Shapiro Developmental Center, lay something the new name could never fully address: decades of accumulated history, buried lives, and institutional patterns that would prove far harder to leave behind than the old name ever was. Chapter 9: The Buried and the Forgotten. Walk far enough beyond the manicured lawns and restored cottages that still greet visitors near the administration center, and the polished National Register version of Kankakee's history begins to fall away. Somewhere on the grounds lies a cemetery unlike almost any other in Illinois. Researchers and descendants who have spent years advocating for the site say it holds more than 5,000 unmarked graves, and yet, walking among them, a visitor would find almost nothing to read. No names carved into stone, nor dates marking a beginning or an end. No epitaphs offering even a fragment of who these people once were. For more than a century, patients who died at Kankakee, far from families who had often abandoned them, long before death were laid to rest beneath the Illinois soil, with little more than a number, if they received even that much. This practice was not unique to Kankakee. Across the country, asylums of this era routinely buried patients in unmarked or numbered graves, a final, quiet erasure that echoed the erasure many of these individuals had already experienced in life, stripped of their names within institutional records, reduced to case numbers, diagnoses, and ward assignments long before death ever arrived. But the scale reportedly held at Kankakee's cemetery, thousands of souls resting without identification, stands as a haunting statistic even by the grim standards of American asylum history. In recent years, descendants researching family members who once lived and died at Kankakee have begun pushing for answers, filing public records requests in an effort to recover names, dates, and any surviving documentation that might restore some fragment of identity to the people buried there. Progress has been slow, and in some cases outright obstructed, records lost, incomplete, or simply never kept, with the kind of care the living residents of the hospital's carefully designed cottages once received. The cemetery is not the only hidden layer beneath Kankakee carefully constructed village atmosphere. Running beneath the campus, connecting building to building far from public view, lies a network of underground utility tunnels, passageways originally built to carry heat, power, and supplies between structures without disrupting the pastoral illusion Cleveland had worked so hard to create above ground. Similar tunnel systems existed at other state institutions of the era, practical infrastructure solutions that also let staff move patients and supplies between buildings without ever crossing the carefully manicured streets meant to convince visitors, and perhaps patients themselves, that they were living in an ordinary town rather than a hospital. Today, these tunnels sit largely abandoned, dark corridors running beneath a campus that long ago outgrew the need for most of them, their concrete walls holding decades of institutional history that no visitor will ever see. Above ground, the contrast between what remains active and what has been left to decay grows sharper with each passing year. Portions of the original administration center, the very wings that once exemplified Kirkbride's vision of total, unbroken supervision, now sit largely unused, their limestone walls intact, but their interiors quiet, stripped of the daily rhythm of patient life that once filled every corridor. The tower itself endures, housing a small museum dedicated to the hospital's history, along with administrative offices that continue Kankakee's institutional purpose in a much diminished form. But walk further into the wings, and empty hallways stretch out where patient wards once operated at full capacity, a physical record of an institution that expanded far beyond what its original architecture could gracefully sustain, and then, decades later, contracted just as dramatically, leaving behind more space than the remaining population would ever need again. It is a strange kind of haunting, not the kind built on ghost stories or supernatural claims, but something quieter and, in many ways, more unsettling. A cemetery with no names, tunnels built to keep suffering out of sight, empty wings standing beside active ones, silent witnesses to just how many lives passed through this carefully disguised village, and simply vanished from the historical record entirely. And, as unsettling as this buried history is, it would soon become clear that Kankakee's darker chapters were not confined entirely to the past. Even in its modern form, stripped of its old name and its old mission, echoes of the very same institutional failures that had plagued the hospital for a century were about to resurface, this time under the full glare of federal scrutiny. Chapter 10. The Ghosts That Remain. Drive past the Shapiro Developmental Center today, and the old tower still rises above the trees exactly as it has for more than a century, a landmark residents of Kankakee have grown up beneath without necessarily knowing its full history. The institution remains very much active. As of a state audit covering fiscal year 2010, the center operated on an annual budget of roughly $68,111,000, supporting a facility that had employed 1,119 staff members, caring for 587 residents. By the time of a more recent human rights review, the resident population had settled at around 475 people, supported by a staff of roughly 1,157, among them psychiatrists, special education teachers, nurses, and social workers overseeing more than 30 separate residential living areas scattered across the campus. On paper, these numbers suggest an institution that has learned from its past, a facility operating at a fraction of its historical peak population, with a far higher staff-to-resident ratio than anything the overcrowded cottages of 1924 could have ever offered. But numbers alone have never told the full story at Kankakee. And in recent years, a very different picture has begun to emerge, one that suggests the institutional patterns first documented more than a century ago never fully disappeared. They simply changed shape. Beginning in late 2022, journalists from Capital News Illinois and ProPublica launched an extensive investigative series into Illinois' state-operated developmental centers, triggered initially by a wave of arrests involving staff members at Choate Mental Health and Developmental Center in the small southern Illinois town of Anna, charged with mistreating the residents in their care. What began as an investigation into a single facility quickly widened. Reporting soon raised similar concerns about multiple institutions within the same state system, Shapiro included. The United States Department of Justice took notice. In 2022, federal investigators opened a formal inquiry into Illinois' treatment of people with developmental disabilities, examining 3 of the state's 7 residential institutions by name: Choate, the Jack Mabley Developmental Center in Dixon, and Samuel Shapiro Developmental Center in Kankakee. It was not the department's first encounter with the Illinois system. The Department of Justice had previously investigated Choate back in 2007, issuing a report in 2009, and continuing to monitor conditions there until 2013, when oversight was finally lifted, a lift that reporting would later suggest may have come too soon. State Human Rights Authority reports filed in the years since paint a granular, unsettling picture of daily life inside Shapiro. Individual case reviews describe residents transferred between facilities, carrying diagnoses of complex psychiatric conditions, complaints alleging inadequate supervision, and investigations into incidents where one resident was harmed by another, all documented under Illinois' own Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities Code, a law explicitly requiring that every recipient of services be provided with adequate and humane care in the least restrictive environment possible. The very existence of these repeated investigations suggests an institution still struggling to consistently meet the standard its own state law demands of it. The troubles have not been confined to allegations of abuse and neglect alone. In recent months, health officials confirmed a case of Legionnaire's disease at the Shapiro campus, prompting immediate safety measures and testing across the facility's water systems. A reminder that the physical infrastructure supporting this sprawling, more than century-old campus carries its own risks entirely separate from questions of patient care. Advocates and journalists covering the story have pointed to a broader, uncomfortable truth. Illinois continues to maintain one of the highest rates of institutionalization for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities anywhere in the United States, a distinction that places the state at odds with a national trend toward community-based care that has been building for decades. For families like that of one mother, who eventually placed her son at Shapiro after exhausting every other option, the institution has represented both a last resort and a source of profound heartbreak. She described a difficult and painful transition, her son arriving calmer in body, but clearly not yet at peace, a small, deeply human snapshot of an institution still wrestling with the same fundamental tension that has defined it since 1879. The gap between the care a place promises and the care it can actually deliver to everyone within its walls. More than 140 years after Kirkbride limestone tower first rose above the Kankakee River, promising that architecture and dignity could heal what chains and neglect never could, the institution built in that promise's name is still being investigated for failing to keep it. Chapter 11. A Tower Still Standing. There is something almost unbearably poignant about a place built with more genuine compassion than nearly any asylum of its era, and yet unable to escape the very same fate. Kankakee State Hospital was never meant to be another grim institution hidden behind high walls. It was meant to be proof that a gentler philosophy could actually work, that dignity itself might function as medicine. For a brief window, spanning roughly the 1880s through the turn of the century, that proof seemed to hold. Reformers like Dorothea Dix and John Dewey lent it their credibility. A young Adolf Meyer built the foundations of modern psychiatry within its tower. Women like Dr. Delia Howe broke barriers inside its wards. It was a genuine success story. And yet none of that compassion, none of that careful design, none of that hard-won progress could hold back the flood that eventually consumed it. The same flood that consumed nearly every asylum built across America during this era. Rising admissions, chronic understaffing, a society increasingly willing to send its unwanted, its inconvenient, and its forgotten toward institutions never built to hold so many. Kankakee's cottages could disguise an asylum as a village, but they could never fully protect the people living inside them from becoming numbers in an overcrowded system, numbers that would eventually be buried without even a name attached. What remains today is a place defined by contradiction, a National Register historic district celebrated for its architectural innovation, standing beside a modern developmental center still facing federal investigation into how it treats the people in its care. A tower that once symbolized total, watchful care, now housing a quiet museum beside empty wings. A cemetery with thousands of graves and almost no names to read. Kankakee's story is not simply a tragedy of the 19th century. It is a warning that continues into the present, a reminder that good intentions are never enough on their own to protect the vulnerable from a system that keeps demanding more than it can humanely give. The river still runs past the old administration center. The tower still watches over Kankakee, just as it has since 1879. And somewhere beneath its shadow, the village that was never really a village keeps its silence, holding a history that Illinois has still not fully reckoned with.